Thank you very much. I won't detain you very long at all. I have the very important job of introducing to you Caroline de Rousseau, who I knew almost in another life 15 years ago. And Caroline is going to introduce our guest speaker, Christian Porter. Caroline.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Caroline de Rousseau, fellow lawyer and state president of the Liberal Party here in Western Australia, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome so many of you to Perth for the Samuel Griffith Society conference this year. Now, I'm especially grateful to those who've made the trek across the country to WA, and yes, it's a long flight, but at least the time difference is only 2 hours at this time of year, so be grateful for it. WA has this remarkable ability to be behind both 2 hours and 35 years, depends on who you speak to. So please enjoy our beautiful city this weekend, soak up the sunshine, take plenty of photos, because you certainly won't be taking any more GST. That's a hill I'm willing to die on, Mitch. So tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honourable Christian Porter. Christian studied at the University of Western Australia, graduating with a Bachelor of Economics and a Bachelor of Arts with First Class Honours, followed by a Bachelor of Laws. He later earned a Master of Science in Political Theory from the London School of Economics, graduating with distinction at the top of his class. He began his professional career as a lawyer at Clayton Utz and later became a senior prosecutor. He also lectured at UWA before entering politics, my alma mater and the alma mater of a number of you in this room. In 2008, Christian entered state politics, serving in key roles including Treasurer and Attorney General in the Barnett government. In 2013, he transitioned to federal politics, representing the electorate of Pierce and holding several senior positions, including Leader of the House, Attorney General, and the Minister for Industrial Relations. Christian retired from politics in 2022 during what can only be described as one of the most unedifying and vicious periods in our national political history. And while his departure was no doubt premature, his contribution to the Liberal Party and to the betterment of this state and our country was immense. That is my personal view, but I suspect I am no orphan in holding it. After politics, Christian returned to the legal profession, this time to the bar, and I knew instinctively that he would do very well. And I want to make one very important point. There's a common view that politicians struggle professionally after leaving political life, that the mire of politics somehow impedes their return to the real world. Sometimes that's true, but more often the struggle stems from the fact that they had little to recommend them in the first place before entering politics. Christian was not and was never going to be one of those people. In showbiz, they talk about unicorns who can sing, dance and act. And in the cocktail of law and politics, Christian is one of those unicorns, someone with business acumen, political nous and intellectual rigour, a rare and refined arsenal. While preparing these remarks, I skimmed recent media coverage, just for a bit of colour and context. Don't worry, I scrolled straight past the ABC, Crikey and The Guardian. But what caught my eye was an AFR headline: How Christian Porter Reinvented Himself as a $7,000 a day barrister. Well, I have 2 points on that headline, and my apologies to the sub-editor. First, Christian hasn't reinvented himself. He's simply returned home to his profession. And second, I think the mention of his rates was perhaps a little gauche, although perhaps a timely reminder to raise them. The article itself didn't offer much at all, but 2 lines stood out, and I quote, "He's done it quietly and for the most part out of the spotlight." And then, "Some of those who have sat alongside him at the bar table say he is a formidable opponent." Quiet and formidable. An excellent observation and quite the compliment. And it's been so satisfying to watch Christian's post-political life, the way he has so effortlessly flipped the bird to his haters, ignored their puritanical howls as he marches back to success in this beautiful profession. Would you please warmly welcome to the stage the Honourable Christian Porter.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Carolyn's President of the Liberal Party of WA, and she'll retire herself next year and take on an easy job brokering an everlasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you for that triple threat. We love the idea of a triple threat in our house. Guys who can sing, dance and act. I keep telling my wife I can dance, but that's not yet believed. And it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I know that there are about 100 people here tonight who are on scholarships. They usually seat you at the back, so I'll just ask whether or not you can all hear me at the back. Good-o. I had, for you young ladies and gentlemen, I had 10 years in federal politics with a country seat, a lot of farmers, and my deep knowledge of farming, very average. But I remember saying at one sort of town hall meeting with farmers, "Can you hear me at the back?" And an old silver fox gent of a farmer stood up from his chair as a tall fellow. He looked the part and he said, "Yes, I can, Mr. Porter, but I'm happy to swap seats with someone who cannot." For all of you, it's a tough game. You've just got to be resilient. Look, it's very pleasing to be here. It's been a very long time since I've given one of these set-piece after-dinner conference-type speeches. In fact, it's a very long time that I've given any kind of speech that I haven't been paid for. And I can hear Stuart Wood laughing very loudly. In fact, it was the last speech of any type I gave outside of a court was before September 2021, when I was sort of politely told I wouldn't be holding the position of Commonwealth Attorney General anymore, and I am extremely rusty. So just bear with me. I vaguely remember the format of these elegant after-dinner speeches, and it's like I tell my young children, it always follows the Greek narrative, elegant speeches. First, the setup. Chapter 1 of the 3-act play. Second, the conflict, some observations about the problem or the issue that needs resolution. Thirdly, the resolution's always got to follow the same form to work. The first part, why are we all here? What's the point, the setting? Getting to know your audience, letting them know that you know them. What's the historical context for us all being here? How is our gathering relevant to modern issues? And that second part is supposed to be entertaining historical and personal anecdotes, some kind of theme about the problem requiring resolution. And then in the third part, what is the resolution? And that's got to come in this sort of subtle way, like an Agatha Christie novel, where all the threads are drawn together. So you're like, oh, is that what it was all about? Right? And of course, it's all got to be upbeat for the younger members of the audience, some kind of sort of exhortation to do something in the nature of a solution to the problem you've identified, something positive that can affect the institutions we're all gathered in service of, the legal profession, the rule of law, public institutions of law and governance, that type of thing. So I do remember how it's supposed to be done. Bad news, totally lost the skill in doing it. Politics totally beat all the optimism out of me, so I've just become this sort of happy, insular, pessimistic barrister. At 55, all I see are problems. I have no solutions at all to them. I'm rusty at public politics. I'm rusty on the law. I have very little to offer you all. I have one, I think, relatively unique experience, and that is perhaps as Carolyn sort of intercepted with, I had a long period in the practice, a long period in politics, and somehow or other I managed to sort of make it back as a relatively normal part of the profession here. And I think maybe if anyone had had the opportunity to speak with Odysseus when he returned from turned to the island of Ithaca after the Trojan Wars and the monsters and the witches and the gods, your instinct might have been to say, tell us about the monsters and the witches and the gods. But another equally happy instinct might have been, how has home changed? Like, what's different? And in politics, I encountered a lot of monsters, witches and gods. That might be worth another speech at another time, but having made the transition back to the real world, perhaps the only thing I can offer you is just some observations about what that has been like coming back to the profession after 14 years. And you do lose touch with the real world in politics. No matter how much you go into it thinking you won't, you will. I remember Ian Macfarlane, who some people in this room will know. He was the industry minister when I first joined Parliament in 2013. He had that wonderful gravelly sort of voice, Ian Macfarlane. And he was the person who was given the job of talking to the sophomores, like the people who got elected in 2013, with the how do you cope with federal politics speech. And it was pretty clear he had no interest in talking to us. He didn't want to be there. He gave the shortest speech I ever heard in federal politics. He said, only two things happen in federal politics. You lose touch and you get fat. And then he said, try and avoid at least one. And he stopped and turned and looked in the corner. He said, don't eat the biscuits. So somehow I managed not to get fat in federal politics. I definitely lost touch. Like, you just invariably lose touch. As hard as you try not to, you do. And you sort of drift from what normal people talk about, and also all the things that you were taught about government, and as hard as you try, you lose touch. So that's what I thought I'd talk about briefly. I've already drifted from the proper format. I haven't even got to part one yet, so we'll just call that a prologue. What I'll do is I'll do it in 3 parts. I'll let you know what the parts are so I remind myself about what I'm supposed to be doing. Part 1, so here we go. Following the usual format, let me welcome you all and subtly provide the framing and contextual and historical reason for why we are all here. You are all at the 35th National Conference of the Samuel Griffith Society. Well done. The conference is being held in Perth. Perth is obviously a city on the western coast of the nation that Sir Samuel Griffith helped to create. Perth is 3,294 kilometres, which is 2,047 miles from Sydney, about the same distance from London to Moscow. When people from Sydney arrive, they always say, wow, that's a long way. You guys really do live a long way away. Remarkably, it's exactly the same distance when we go to Sydney. I married a delightful girl from Sydney. I can say to all of you in the room from Sydney, when you first arrive to come live with your husband and see Perth, the appropriate phrase is not, where are all the people? So most of you visiting for Perth for this conference are from what we simply refer to in Perth as the eastern states, that is to say physically everywhere other than Western Australia. Because you're here for a conference which was inspired by a man who pursued the complicated structural task of nationhood from the sort of tension position of both a federalist, Samuel Griffith, and almost a romantic civic nationalist, you as a group, knowing that history, at least have a head start when you visit Perth, that you're generally aware of the particular complications of Perth and Western Australia's relationship with the rest of the country. But a refresher on the basics. We tried to get out of the Federation in 1933, sorry about that, when the majority of Western Australians voted in favour of leaving the Australian Commonwealth and returning to being a self-governing colony of the British Empire. Obviously, when we petitioned the British Parliament, the British government declined to grant the request very politely, citing the Statute of Westminster 1931, which they said limited their power to amend the Australian Constitution. Bit of a cop-out, really. Anyway, that's why you can all come over to this conference without a passport or a stamped card. Sadly, neither the Statute of Westminster 1931 or the Constitution stopped us from requiring a stamped card when you visited or tried to visit in 21 and 22. You needed the G2G pass. They were in very short supply. But anyway, you're welcome back now, so all's forgiven. When we originally got into the Federation in 1901, we got in very late. It was on 31 July 1900 that WA had its referendum to become the final Australian colony to vote for Federation. And by this point, the new Australian Constitution had already been proclaimed by Queen Victoria, omitting reference to Western Australia in the preamble, because we were yet to make up our mind about joining you lot and whether we would become an original state. So we've always been seen by the eastern states to be a little bit behind since this start. And I understand that more than half of the people tonight are from the eastern states, and it's a warm welcome. There's a line of jokes that I've seen recently about nicknames that tradies and people from offices give their colleagues. So you probably might have heard some of this, but you get the picture. Wicketkeeper puts on the gloves and stands back. Sensor light only works if someone walks past. Wheelbarrow only works when pushed. Paper straw, someone who works but not for long. Apparently, there is a nickname for people of our ilk, Perth, 3 hours behind everyone else. Obviously, that comedian's from the eastern states. They didn't get their G2G pass, so sad we're not welcoming them. We're all concerned in the Samuel Griffith Society about how Federation should operate, what's the manual, who drafted it, how it might work better. And I saw over 14 years in politics that it is a very strange relationship between WA and the rest of the nation. We in WA regularly do two things. We pretend that we don't desperately want to be liked by people from the eastern states. And we work very hard at appearing like we don't care about you all, when deep down we really hate how deeply indifferent you are to all of us here in WA. People in the eastern states might be forgiven for thinking that a chip on our shoulder here makes us unbalanced in our approach to you from the eastern states. What you all have to understand helpfully is that when you have a chip on both shoulders, everything feels totally balanced. I'm going to give you a quick contextual example. This is from the West Australian newspaper, January 18, 1890, Perth, Saturday. So this is 135 years ago. The article begins, "Sir Samuel Griffith's visit to our colony may in large part be accepted as evidence of the increased space which we fill in the eyes of our neighbours." That's how the article from January 18, 1890 starts. Now, just so I can sort of translate for you, our neighbours, that is all you from the eastern states, right? And tonight, we're very happy to have you all over here as our neighbours from the eastern states at the 35th conference of the Sir Samuel Griffith Society, just like 135 years ago at a ballroom, not more than 150 metres from here. We were very happy to have Sir Samuel Griffiths himself. There were a few buts in the article. That so experienced and keen a politician should have been prompted to seek enlightenment, not from the too frequently loose statements of visitors with but a few weeks' experience, and that not of a comprehensive type, but by himself going in person to the fountainhead, may without undue vanity be taken to show that Western Australia is emerging from her long seclusion and that soon she will become as distinct a factor in the national life as any of her sister colonies. So just so it's clear, to anyone in the room from Sydney, Sir Samuel Griffiths comes to West Australia, here to Perth, from Queensland obviously, to seek enlightenment from us Western Australians. That's the aforementioned fountainhead, right, in the article. Loose statements of visitors with a few weeks' experience, that's most of you. You don't want to be one of those, so stay for a bit longer. So most people at this event down the road, other than Sir Samuel Griffiths himself, they only had a few days' experience at Perth. If you want to think about, picture that for yourself, Think, for instance, of Melbourne silks coming over for a few days in the industrial relations courts, having a few long lunches, going back and saying, oh, well, the coffee was expensive. The hotels are just okay, and the airport is full of people in high vis, but otherwise it was fine. You know who you are. I might pause on industrial relations just for a second, if you just indulge me. I've got a young boy, he's doing very well at school, and he came home with a very bad mark, and he'd be given a test from school. This is absolutely legitimate. This was a test in the West Australian school system for Year 4. The question was this, verbal reasoning. Read the text below, then answer the questions. Imagine that you're a restaurateur with a franchise of restaurants across the state. Your holdings include a fancy city restaurant with river views, a number of internet cafes for patrons on a budget, and a mobile burger stands in remote areas. You're looking for someone to run your remote burger outlets. It's mobile, just a catering van with awnings. You've chosen a strong candidate for the position, but they want to be paid more than the city chefs who run your most popular restaurants. What do you do? Multiple choice. This is Year 4 in our primary schooling system in WA. Young Master Porter is confronted with the following options. A, play to the person's interest to ensure that they give in and take the job with the same pay. B, discuss labour laws in relation to remote work experience and the requirements of the job position to determine the correct wage. C, take over the position you don't need the hassle of a whinging employee. D, start crying and complaining about the economy in Perth. My young boy went for C, take over the position as you don't need the hassle of a whinging employee. His first 0 in any test. They then pose this question, any other suggestions, please write here. The young boy says, politely inform them that no one in this country thinks they're not a bit of an idiot for turning down a perfectly good job. Year 4, not bad, not bad. Where was I? I can't remember now. Anyway, we're at the part 1 and having a few jokes about you all being from the eastern states. So, look, being here is, for all of us, a privilege, whether you're from the east or the west. And that article I was reading you had a little interesting tale to it. So it says, and it goes on, with Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane each connected by rail, the 4 principal colonies are brought together in easy communication. But when our neighbours are discussing our affairs, even with the utmost of friendliness and sympathy, they are ignorant of our position, doubtful as to the exact nature of our wishes, and not quite sure in their minds as to the best means of advancing our cause. So again, in the modern translation of that sentiment, and it's a very long-standing sentiment in WA, is that you lot from the eastern states, we think that you all talk amongst yourselves about us as you're zipping around on your fancy rail cars. You don't talk about us as much as you should, but from time to time we think that you do talk about us behind our back, and we're not sure it's all that positive. We do know that what you say should be positive, and if it's not positive, we know it's because you never take the time to understand us and stay here long enough, and you should because we're critically important. And finally, our deepest fear is that you don't ever talk about us at all. And no kidding, the article ends this way. On such occasions, it is the privilege of Perth as the capital to represent the colony at large, to entertain our distinguished visitor at a citizen's banquet. It must be admitted that for a holiday visit, there is an abundance of places more attractive than our colony. We have not very much which to amuse or entertain our guests, and a holiday speaker, especially a busy man with a large demand upon his time, might be pardoned if he sought more attractive shores. But Sir Samuel Griffith has divined that there may be much that is instructive in a visit to this remote side of Australia. So even starting in 1890, right, we had this view that you all from the eastern states, you don't visit enough, you don't listen enough. And then in 1890, we felt compelled to disclose this crazy, insecure belief that we think there are better places to go for a holiday. And we were surprised that Senator Griffith even visited at all. He could have gone to the Gold Coast, right? The same sentiment persists in exactly the same form today. It is a truly weird mix, this relationship. We have a deep but not well hidden insecurity that we secretly feel validated when you come here from the eastern states. When you do come here, we spend most of the time informing you of how little you know about us, our state, and why you should come here more often. But at the same time, we worry about why you ever came here in the first place. And that is because when anyone who actually lives here gets to go and have a holiday, we go to Bali. Anyway, that was a very long welcome, part one. It's going to be much quicker from here. Part two, I promised I'd say something about returning to the profession of the law after 14 years. I had, before the law, about a decade or so bouncing around minor courts and learning the basics of advocacy of a trade, civil litigation, and as a Crown prosecutor. I then had 14 years in politics. My last trial before entering politics was December 2007. It was a very serious matter. I remember it very well. Then I came back after 14 years and did immediately a 6-week multi-accused matter about a very complicated sort of Mission Impossible style gun heist. Like 400 high-powered long and short arms were stolen. My client was convicted. I like to think it was less about my rustiness as an advocate and more about his DNA being over all the guns, but there are a lot of changes in the legal profession in 14 years, particularly in the practice of criminal law. And this is in no particular order, and I'll try and weave them for you at the end, but I'm sitting in this long trial about stealing high-powered weapons, and it occurred to me there are no bank robberies anymore. In the 1990s and 2000s, there were a lot of bank robberies. So it was a thing. People were robbing banks. And likely it's a combination of several things why there aren't many bank robberies, really any anymore, but overall the risks are probably higher and the rewards lower. There was that famous American bank robber, Willie Sutton, when he was asked why he robbed banks, he said that's where the money is, right? It's actually not true anymore. There's less cash in teledrawers and EFT, and there's just less physical money circulating inside banks. Advanced security systems. The 4 big banks, they closed all the branches, which are distant and easy to get away from, which is annoying for elderly customers and bank robbers, apparently. But so it was a sort of surprise to me there was less of that. Thumb drives. Briefs used to come in these lever arch folders. All the lawyers in the room would have experienced, they just come in thumb drives, and I sort of skipped the in-between. CCTV, surveillance is absolutely ubiquitous. And it's not a growth in surveillance that we all expected reading Orwell in 1984. It's not some monopoly surveillance of governments on citizens. We are surveilling ourselves. Citizens are surveilling other citizens. And so, for example, if a crime occurs at position X, then the police go out and do what they call a CCTV canvass. And every second house has got a camera pointing out into the road. And the police just canvass back. So they can track a car from the point, or an individual from the point of the crime, back tens and tens of kilometres. And everything everyone does, by virtue of being members of the citizenry, filming each other basically, is all totally surveilled. Dash cams, people have them to view out of their car, right, for other terrible drivers. Of course, they record audio into the car. So everything that you say when you're driving is on dash cam. I wouldn't have one. In fact, we don't, because our conversations are a bit fruity at times in the car. AI is a huge change. I've got many clients coming in with what AI has told them about their criminal case, what their liberty depends on. I look at it, go, that's total rubbish, and then highlight the good bits. Generation Z, you're all in the back, right, with the weird aunts at the wedding. Right? But you're a good generation. Generation X finds you difficult to understand, but you're digital natives. So this thumb drive stuff, you're all over it. You've got enormous skills in research. You're going to make amazing contributions to the profession. You're going to make great lawyers. Your expectations on workplace working hours and structure? I mean, I'm about to lose my clerk and we talk to new clerks, and it's specifically for the job of clerking to assist barristers in court. And inevitably the first question in any interview is, what hours will I be able to choose for work? I go, well, court starts at 10 and finishes at 4, so why don't we go for 9 to 5? I'm not sure that's going to work for me. The last change I want to talk about is the presence of government in people's lives. And governments are becoming, in my observation, back into practice for the last couple of years, more and more controlling in their approach, almost rapacious in their approach to interfering in people's lives. The things that bring members of the Sir Samuel Griffith Society together are foundationally about being vigilant to this sort of thing and the appetites of governments and how they should properly and democratically be constrained. And I don't know whether it's just my small practice or the residual guilt of having been in a government or some kind of PTSD from being part of both state and federal governments. Probably it's a bit of all three. I might be paranoid, but in practice, I've just become more and more aware of how governments intrude into people's lives and encroach on people's everyday business as usual. And just expect that they should have this power to corral the way people think and speak and act. And it's all done routinely. So I'm left with this overarching, very strong sense that this intrusion just happens more and more frequently with more and more heavy-handedness. And it's not about party politics. I suspect that after COVID, when there was this period of extraordinary government control, of which I shamefully was a part, right? And it made sense at the time, but it was almost as if the bar got reset as to what people might expect from governments. And it's not even that the desire or want to control is malicious or coordinated or even thoughtful. It's expectant, almost casual, the way governments do it now. And troublingly, it seems to be accepted with much less pushback from citizens as a whole. Sort of seems to be sort of normalised. And I have a small practice, it's going okay, but I'm just gobsmacked at how often I encounter this government intrusion. Several clients that I can think of that have suffered from this, I'd sort of sat down and wrote a list. Most of them are going on appeal, so I can't talk about them in any great detail, which probably doesn't say a lot for the advocacy at first instance, but these things are tough to win. But I've had Aboriginal Heritage Act prosecutions, which are unbelievably heavy-handed, like people who have repaired a pre-existing culvert crossing on their property. I've had criminal matters, civil matters, two very different criminal and civil matters, both of them now subject to High Court actions, and the central issues, one of them centrally involves one of my clients, so I can't talk about it too much, but in the course of representing clients in both of these matters, and they both dealt with some potential mistake in the exercise of executive power by government decision makers. In both matters, the present federal government simply passed retrospective legislation seeking to fix the previous potential errors. And it's sort of legislation of the type that essentially says if decision X was wrong or the last process got certain information for the prosecution that was wrongfully gotten, this legislation now makes that wrong decision right. And that was done with little, if any, real parliamentary opposition in the last 2 years. So that sort of use of retrospective and moderate, excessive, sometimes just downright harsh legislative provisions to stop something or someone that's considered undesirable, it's becoming more and more frequent. And it very often starts with making the person or thing extremely unpopular. And that dampens parliamentary will to oppose it. It dampens the enthusiasm outside it amongst lawyers or others to oppose it. One example I can think of that's been made extremely unpopular is the owners of firearms with legitimate firearms licences. And I've had a client and clients whose livelihoods depend on owning firearms, shooting feral animals. people who've long held firearms licences, they've broken no law, but they've now lost their licence under a new WA 2024 Firearms Control Act. In one case, what's known as a conduct agreement order, so an order designed by consent to avoid contested applications for restraining orders. So two parties who agree that each of them won't do or will do certain things. And part of the agreement was that the person who was a party, my client, could keep their firearms licence because both parties' livelihood depended on the firearms licence, right? And the new Firearms Act 2024, which has retrospective effect, now argued that that order, which was by agreement of the parties, stamped in the magistrate's court, is now an order that automatically disqualifies the person from owning a firearms licence. An order where they agreed and the court stamped it, they could own a firearm. And that same legislation now allows by regulation for any order of any court to be a disqualifying order. Right? A bankruptcy order, some order about property. And kind of happened without much opposition, very little media attention, and people just lose their jobs, can't pay mortgages. I've worked for Clive Palmer, who's not a very popular person at times in this state, and the Iron Ore Processing Mineralogy Pty Ltd Agreement Amendment Act was a law passed to basically eradicate Mr Palmer's rights, and he'd won an arbitral award about a frustrated iron ore state agreement. The award of damages existed. It was a legal right, arguably a property right. The award of damages, whatever it was undeniably real, the product and the operation of orthodox normal law. In the days before the legislation was passed by the state Labor government here to extinguish that award of damages, they, the state government, were still actively engaged in mediation with Clive Palmer and Mineralogy about determining the amount of the award. It was days before the legislation is passed. Then the legislation's passed. Now, this was subject to High Court challenge, and I think the coarsest summary here of that decision might be to say that governments can and do extinguish rights, even if rights to an award of damages follow an arbitration process. Governments extinguish rights. But what was remarkable to me, and the disclaimer is that I've had Mr Palmer as a client, obviously, but there was something quite extraordinary in this very remarkable act, section 20, subsection 8. No appeal or review or criminal liability in respect of protected matters. Any conduct of the state that occurs or arises before, on or after commencement and that is or is connected with a protected matter does not constitute an offence at criminal law and is taken never to have constituted an offence. Wow. Right? And conduct in respect to protected matters is basically defined as any conduct in any way associated with drafting, passage, or even the tactical planning of the legislation. So the rule of law, you might think, would hold that in general terms the government and its officials should be subject to the same liabilities, civil and criminal, as ordinary citizens. But parliaments increasingly legislate themselves special protection. And there are, of course, examples of circumstances where Australian laws provide for immunity from criminal liability, but they usually apply to police officers or corrective services officials, and almost always those are drafted in that formula that many would be familiar with, that things have to be done in good faith. None of that in this legislation. I mean, really quite remarkable. So I always did my best in government to restrain that sort of excess, but you lose touch when you're in government. So part 3, and this is the end, it'll be quick. I suppose the point is that some things change, some stay the same. What stays the same, or maybe has gotten progressively worse, is that governments have a natural tendency to want to exert control over people they govern in every conceivable way, by taking more decisions away from citizens that they would otherwise exercise for themselves. And everyone, particularly the young lawyers in this room, should be very vigilant to this. And why the young lawyers? You're going to be better than us. I suppose you need to be most vigilant because it's your freedoms and your flexibilities, in your language, right, that'll be taken away. You're the people who will need to be relied on to push back against all of this. And judicial review of constitutionality of legislation is a part of the answer. Using orthodox reasoning, though, that we heard about today, and respecting the separation of powers, judicial review will always have a limited ability to curb the excesses of executive government. True separation of powers means that executive governments are invariably left with great sphere, as they should be, to behave both well and very badly and excessively, with the only ultimate cure being to vote in better, less excessive governments. Dyson Hayden's here. There's a wonderful paper that he presented at one of these conferences. The Sir Samuel Griffith, as Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia, it was the 5th Sir Harry Gibbs Memorial Oration. And in that paper, he noted that a striking feature of both the American and the Australian system of federal government was that the judiciary is accepted to have power to declare legislation unconstitutional and treat individual legislative provisions as nullities. And that is despite no apparent power in the US Constitution and despite the slightly vague basis for the power in Section 75 of the Australian Constitution. And Mr Hayden called that the power of judicial legislative review, the humblest and most mediocre magistrate having the power to declare invalid the most carefully and solemnly considered Commonwealth or state statutes. Long may that live, but it requires lawyers to run the cases and be bold. It requires pushback. And that and the much older tradition and legal ability to judicially review administrative action is never more important than it is now. But as I say, with orthodox reasoning and a respect for legislatures, it'll always have a limit. And Sir Samuel Griffith's views on limiting government power were always, it appears to me at least, rooted in his belief that the importance of federalism and the need for a balance between central and state authority is completely critical. Also very interesting that Griffith and all of the other Australian statesmen who were founding fathers who declared you must limit the Commonwealth Government's powers or jump ship and join the Commonwealth straight away, but this stuff happens. But finally, whatever is the layer of government whose powers need more protecting, and what is the government layer that needs more restraining, it's not unimportant, and it has always fascinated Western Australians, but it can obscure the fundamental fact, which is increasingly becoming obvious, that both state and federal governments can be extremely poor, extremely excessive. And let's not even start on local government. When state and or federal government behave excessively, they are at least both as bad as each other, as we saw often during COVID. So for the young lawyers in the room, to some extent, you will be able to make this better being good, vigilant lawyers in individual cases, using judicial review of legislation and judicial review of administrative action. But the ultimate remedy to bad government is, unfortunately for all of you, to have generally better governments and better parliaments, and that means that some of you will go on to be lawyers and engage in this critical review of government. Some of you will need to go into parliaments. And it is really tough. But I wouldn't stop or advise any of you not to have that ambition, because we will depend on you doing that. The problems with government ultimately are only going to be improved by electing better governments. And some of you, once you get into government and parliament, you're going to get into executive government. Be very careful. Very careful. When you get into executive government, you good young lawyers, right, you will have to remember that you are becoming part of a very powerful and exclusive club, a club you've worked your whole life to become a part of. But this is the one club, the club you work so hard to become a part of, executive government. It is the one club that as soon as you get into it, the one thing that you should have least trust in and most cause to restrain is the club that you have just become a member of. It reminds me of what was said by Marx. not Carl, Groucho. The one thing that you should be most suspicious of is any club that would have you as a member. Or as Ronald Reagan said in his inauguration in 1981, in the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to ask Rebecca Clough to propose a vote of thanks. Rebecca is a pillar of the society in this state. Please welcome Rebecca.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a proud Western Australian, it is a great pleasure to propose this vote of thanks to Christian on behalf of us all. We have enjoyed a very pertinent and entertaining dinner speech. Build on the program as reflections on a return to the profession begs the question as to why Christian, why he left in the first place in order to return. Law is about what is, and politics is about what should be. And I say that with no apologies to activist judges. Christian, we profoundly thank you for your significant political career, where you courageously prosecuted and pursued what should be. The headlines: Attorney General and Treasurer in the West Australian Parliament, Attorney General for the Commonwealth of Australia. In both spheres, you were commonly spoken of as a future Premier and a potential Prime Minister. Christian, I believe that you can wear as a lifetime badge of honour the fact that the left went for you so falsely and vindictively because they correctly assessed the electoral danger you pose for them. We welcome you back to the folds of the legal profession. You have outstanding precedents, Sir Garfield Barwick and the Honourable Tom Hughes, to name but two. Wherever you take your future legal profession, we will be cheering for you from the benches. So, ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses to Christian Porter.